Thank you. This is a loaded question since we're talking about hearing loss, but can everybody hear me? We'll see. I'm going to try to point on both slides, but I apologize if I leave you guys out, or I have to leave you guys out. Probably you guys are going to be left down since I'm just parking it over here at the beginning. But I appreciate that introduction, and thank you. Essentially what that means, I'm a board-certified otolaryngologist. I'm an ENT physician. My med school buddies joke that I drop the N and the T and all I see is ears. I'm just an ear surgeon. You told me about your sore throat, I'd tell you to go talk to your doctor. Some disclosures. I actually do receive some financial relationships with 2 cochlear implant companies. I receive travel funding from MED-EL, it's an Austrian cochlear implant company, and then research funding from Advanced Bionics and MED-EL, neither of which have anything to do with this talk, at least with the research portion. So, as I mentioned, what is neuro-otology? So neuro-otology, if you actually Google this like 2 years ago, there's an SNL skit that is terribly inappropriate and terribly inaccurate. But neuro-otology is closely related to otology, but adds the training and skill to operate within the skull on the parts of the brain and nervous system related to hearing imbalance. So while we are going to be talking about hearing loss, I'll briefly talk about hearing aids and cochlear implants. There's a lot more to my practice than just hearing. But as Dr. Laird mentioned, I was recently awarded a $600,000 grant to study hearing loss and cochlear implants, which is going to be the main focus of kind of this talk. So while this talk is going to be talking about research, I've recognized by giving this talk, a lot of people might not focus on the research, but might think about a loved one that this might be applicable to in their families. This is a cochlear implant. How many people here have seen a cochlear implant on a patient before? It's not bad. Granted, this audience should, hopefully. I guess the follow-up question is, how many people know someone that has hearing loss or thinks they know somebody that has hearing loss? Okay, good. And how many people here know somebody that wears hearing aids? Okay. How many people know somebody that should wear hearing aids but doesn't? Okay. And that's what part of I think we're going to get to today about the relationship of hearing loss and cognition. So this is a cochlear implant. This is a receiver stimulator the processor over the ear. You can see it here. There's 2 companies that actually make it, so you don't need to wear this. There's one device that just goes over the magnet. And then this is what actually goes in. This is what we do surgically. We make an incision behind the ear. I place an electrode into the cochlea. We place this receiver stimulator underneath the skin. There is a magnet in there, and the only reason for that magnet is to adhere to the external portions to allow them to communicate. A cochlear implant still works without a magnet. It's just a little difficult. And sometimes, actually, in a couple weeks, I actually have to take a magnet out of a kid because he has plan to have recurrent MRIs. And then this is an example of the internal kind of schematic with the idea that this is the cochlea, the electrodes in the cochlea. It's stimulating the auditory nerve directly, as opposed to a natural mechanism of hearing. Sound goes into the auditory canal, vibrates the tympanic membrane, moves the ossicles, that generates a fluid wave within the cochlea. We're bypassing that altogether with a cochlear implant. So while we generally counsel a hearing aid would be able to restore your hearing, all hearing is sound pressure wave, a cochlear implant is slightly different. A lot of people will say humans sound like Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse. Some people don't necessarily agree with it and say people sound totally normal. But it is slightly different. It does require the brain to relearn. And again, that goes back to the relationship we'll discuss today. So, kind of an outline of this talk. I'm going to talk about hearing loss. What is hearing loss? How do we define hearing loss? Things we can do to measure hearing loss. It's going to be a brief overview. There's a lot of research in cochlear implants that can go into very detailed aspects of hearing loss, and I'll briefly mention those. The relationship with hearing loss and depression, social isolation, loneliness, and cognition. And that's kind of the brunt of this talk, with the idea of what is the role of cognition and or listening effort in hearing loss. Some of the interventions that people have already kind of looked at, let's be real here, we've kind of already talked about 2 of them, hearing aids and cochlear implants. And then the hope when we first discussed this was I was hoping to provide some preliminary data that we've already accrued at UT Southwestern. I can't provide you that data today, but I can briefly discuss the study with you guys and answer any questions you guys might have. So what is hearing loss? Hearing loss in every ENT office consists of an audiogram. And an audiogram consists of a pure tone audiometry. That's what I'm sure most, if not everybody here has heard the tones. That's all it is. You hear a tone in your right ear, you hear a tone in your left ear, raise your hand. This is an actually example of an audiogram at UT. The way I remember it is right, red, round. So I don't know how all these colors are coming up, but circles, the red at the top is the right ear, the blue is the left ear. And again, that's tones. That's not understanding whether or not we gave you a word. It's literally the ability to hear a tone. The other component to an audiogram is the word recognition score. And the word recognition score consists of a list of generally about 50 words. Sometimes they'll do 25, but they're either monosyllabic or bisyllabic. The idea is to repeat these words. And so it's one thing to be able to understand tones. There are some situations where you might have totally normal hearing, and normal hearing is anywhere from 0 decibels to 20 decibels at the top of this graph. But you might not understand any word whatsoever. And when I say any word, it's like Charlie Brown's mom. You can hear she's talking to you, you just have no idea what she's saying to you. And so with this being decibels on the y-axis, frequency on the x-axis, this is a logarithmic scale. So 0 decibels is what's considered a 21-year-old adult would be able to hear 50% of the time. To give you a perspective, that's leaves rustling in the wind. 120 decibels, that's a jet engine. I mean, again, extremely loud. That's actually dangerous, and ear protection is warranted. But there's two components, and I want to emphasize that. I mean, a hearing aid is going to amplify the tones and would hopefully increase the word recognition. But the concern is when this number drops, no one, and I don't mean to say this unilaterally, but if everyone sounds like Charlie, if some patient has a hearing loss that everyone sounds like Charlie Brown's mom, what's the value of a hearing aid for that patient? It's just amplifying that wah, wah, wah. That's when we start talking about a cochlear implant. And there's some insurance criteria that will enable us to implant an implant. They're not cheap, so we try to adhere to them pretty well. But the idea is when this word rec, as well as these tonal lines tend to drop down here, that's when we talk about a cochlear implant, when patients start struggling with their hearing aids. But let's be real here. Most patients don't like their hearing aids. It's very rare that a patient likes their hearing aids. So while that is an old school rule of thumb, we're generally using this word recognition to identify who might be a cochlear implant candidate. That doesn't mean this dictates cochlear implantation candidacy. We actually do more extensive testing. I presented you an example of 50 words. We actually provide patients sentences, 20 sentences that are a little more challenging. Not only can we provide them to them in quiet, but we can also challenge them in putting noise in the other ear. And we actually talked about this in Journal Club this morning. We can do testing, and it's a little finagling, but I can make every one of you in this room a cochlear implant candidate if I challenged you hard enough. You would not be able to understand the words. Now, again, there's rules and regulations, and we try to adhere to that. But again, there is a lot more fanciful testing that we can do. An experiment that I did in fellowship, or we were able to do in fellowship, in an anechoic chamber. An anechoic chamber is a room that has no sound. You walk in, I guarantee you, every one of you guys has tinnitus. It's terrible. But the issue is, you walk in, and we put a speaker array in front of you, a speaker every 3 degrees. Our ears are so good that we can actually close our eyes and point to a speaker within 3 degrees where we actually hear that sound. We take one ear out, and that drops completely. You take that left ear out, you might notice the sounds coming from your left, but you're not able to specify exactly where it's coming from. Again, there's significantly more testing than we can do than just this basic pure tone audiogram in the office. But this gives us a good idea from an ENT office perspective who might have hearing loss and who might not. So what does this mean? So hearing loss incidence. This is actually data out of the National Health Examination Survey, also known as the NHANES survey from the CDC. These numbers are a little small, but the dark bars are from the 1999 to 2004 survey. The lighter bars are from the 2011 and 2012. Back 20 years ago, they didn't realize we should be hearing testing everybody, so they actually only tested half of those patients in the dark bars when they actually tested all those patients in the light bars. Nonetheless, there's fewer patients. But as you can see, there's two purposes of this graph. One, as we get older, hearing loss incidence increases, and that's probably fits our mold, what we think. As we get older, we lose hearing. But what's a little interesting, and I don't want you to take this home as a hard and fast rule, is the hearing loss incidence has decreased. And there's a lot of controversy with that. There's thoughts to be that it could be related to age-related hearing loss, reduction in exposure to occupational noise, less smoking, better management of cardiovascular risk factors, and someone has even thought that there's fewer ear infections. We don't necessarily believe that to be the case. But again, how do we define hearing loss? And this goes back to this entire talk, goes back to every single slide I'm going to show you. Most patients and most studies are defining hearing loss based on this pure tone audiogram. What we're going to be doing is we're going to sum the average and find the average at 500, 1,000, 2,000, and possibly 4,000 hertz, and that's up here. So that's your pure tone average. There's a 3 frequency, and sometimes a 4 frequency pure tone average. But I want to emphasize, that's not necessarily meaning anything. You might have a normal, healthy pure tone average, but if you don't understand words, it doesn't really do you any good. So that's a caveat to a lot of research I'll be presenting. Did I lose it? Apologize. There it goes. This is out of a separate survey. This is from I forget the acronym. This is from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System from 2016. They called over 477,000 adults, and they asked them, can you hear in noisy situations? Again, the point being, as you can see, and I'll show in the red graphic, as we get older, hearing loss, incidence of hearing loss increases. This is comparing to patients between the ages of 18 to 29 in 10-year categories. And this should come up. And we're talking a 40-fold increase after controlling for other risk factors compared to patients between the ages of 18 and 29. So it's generally thought the hearing loss estimates anywhere from around 9% of adults between the ages of 50 and 64 have hearing loss, upwards of greater than 50% over 75. I think if you guys looked around the room to begin with, pretty much everyone in this room knows somebody that has hearing loss. However, only fewer than 1/3 of adults who could benefit from a hearing aid ever get one. And there's a debate on this. And when I say there's a debate, one study actually surveyed 4,000 individuals with hearing loss, and they noted that expense, the cost of a hearing aid, was the most important impediment to the purchase of hearing aids. And just to give you a perspective, an average hearing aid costs $2,400. I'm talking per ear. You want to go out, you want to buy a hearing aid, you're looking at $4,800, $5,000 for both ears. I use the analogy of kind of like a car. Hearing aids will get you from point A to point B. You can drive in like a Ford Pinto and get there for like $500, or you could buy a Rolls, still be able to help you out, but you're dropping $8,000 to get you some pretty nice microphones. When I say there's a controversy, we just met last week at the General Otolaryngology meeting in Atlanta. And there were people there in Atlanta saying the biggest impediment for people wearing hearing aids was vanity, which, again, I mean, for some, I'm not saying that's not the case, but, I mean, again, there's some controversy. And I can understand. I had a 25-year-old woman that came into my office that definitely has some hearing loss, and mom was pushing hearing aids, and she's like, I don't want to. And that's a big debate, and hopefully this research can parse out some of that information that maybe we can counsel her later on. It would be beneficial. To put in perspective, though, while I say the average hearing aid costs $2,400, most insurance does not cover. Most of this is out of pocket. However, unless you're a vet, the VA will cover your hearing aid. The VA paid for 800,000 hearing aid units in 2015. That accounted for 1/5 the entire market. And I don't know how well people are paying attention to the national news, I'm sure, but it's not the top of the line in the national news, is the idea that it was recently passed as a federal law that we can be able to go into CVS and Walgreens and buy hearing aids. Most ENTs are not happy with that, with the idea that one size does not fit all. Nonetheless, we are probably going to be able to provide people hearing amplification much easier than we could in the past. But again, one size does not fit all. So again, the associations with hearing loss: depression, social isolation and or loneliness, caregiver burden. I'll briefly get into that a little, as well as cognitive decline. So one of the first studies that looked at depression, and this actually came out of Columbia, New York City. This is a health, aging, and body composition study, and I'll refer to this in a couple different things. This is also known as the HBC study. And they looked at over 3,000 patients, all over the ages, or all between the ages of 70 and 79. And so they looked at 1,000 of those patients that had self-reported hearing categories with a Center for Epidemiologic Studies depression scale. It's essentially a questionnaire, 20-item or an abbreviated 10-item questionnaire that essentially broke down depression into 3 categories. Someone that has a low probability depression, essentially a medium probability depression, and a high probability depression. And they found that people that were more likely to get high probability and or intermediate probability depression had some form of hearing loss. And that also carried over to a high versus low. So high versus medium, high versus low. Loneliness. This is actually UCLA. The UCLA has kind of validated a loneliness scale. I want to define loneliness as a discrepancy between a person's preferred and actual level of social contact. The prevalence of loneliness in the U.S. is thought to be somewhere between 20 and 40%. I think most of us are aware of that individual that we know that might have hearing loss, and they find, especially significant hearing loss, they might not want to socialize because they can't hear. They find themselves alone, not talking at the dinner table because they're unable to participate because they don't know what their hearing is. So this one group, they looked at 113 adults all over the age of 50, all with what we call postlingual hearing loss, meaning they were able to hear well and then unfortunately lost it for a number of reasons. They were then given the loneliness scale before they were given either a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, and then assessed on their loneliness 6 and 12 months after given this. So on the left in red is actually the hearing aid portion, and on the right is the blue is the cochlear implant portion. This is comparing the baseline changes scores of their loneliness. So before they got a hearing aid to 1 year after they got the hearing aid or after they got the cochlear implant. And so at 12 months in both these graphs, they found a significant decrease in loneliness at 12 months in both the cochlear implant and hearing aid cohorts. Interestingly, at 6 months, there was no significant difference in the hearing aid group, but 6 months after a cochlear implant, there was a significant improvement in loneliness. In caregiver burden, this is one of the few studies looking at it, and we're actually looking at this at UT Southwestern. This was out of Japan. And they looked at 1,200 community-dwelling older adults and their paired caregivers. Those caregivers ranged in age from anywhere from 31 to 90, but generally, on average, they were 65 years of age. And they administered to these caregivers what we call the Zaret Burden Interview, the ZBI. And it consists of an 88-point scale, mainly considered as a Likert scale, kind of 1 to 5. And they found significantly higher average caregiver ZBI scores for recipients with hearing impairment compared to those without. Again, with the idea that caregivers might be frustrated with the communication issues with the patient, and that might be contributing to the burden. Kind of an anecdotal case, I was at a cochlear implant meeting in British Columbia, a slightly different insurance system, but a patient had Alzheimer's disease, and the decision was made to place a cochlear implant in this patient. And we won't get into the ethical discussion about that, but everybody agreed that this was the right thing to do. But what's difficult is obviously someone with Alzheimer's disease, we're going to have a very difficult time assessing their hearing. Turns out, while again, difficult to assess the patient with a cochlear implant, everyone in the entire family, their quality of life went through the roof because they found it was easier to communicate with that patient, even though that patient might not be able to understand truly or what they were talking about. So again, the idea is improving the hearing might reduce caregiver burden. And then cognition, and this is kind of the brunt of the entire talk, and we'll go back to kind of the beginning. And so the first study that actually came out was in 2011. This was out of Hopkins, and so there's a study called the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging. This was formed in 1958 just outside of Baltimore, where patients are asked to come in every other year for 2.5 days, 2.5 days, for intensive testing. These are high socioeconomic individuals who volunteer. So caveat to where we can extrapolate this data. But what they did is, beginning in 1990 and 1994, between those 4 years, they started providing hearing tests. And they also wanted to make sure no one had dementia. They defined dementia as a group of, I guess, a panel, if you will, to determine whether that patient had dementia or not. We're not talking a hard and fast rule. It's essentially a subjective classification. And they wanted to look at those patients with normal hearing loss and follow them. So they followed them up until, forget the exact year, it was in May 2008. And they wanted to look at the incidence of all-cause dementia. So we're talking Alzheimer's, we're talking Lewy body, we're talking vascular dementia, any type. And sure enough, they found in the left, as the hearing loss, the greater the hearing loss, and again, defining hearing loss as a pure tone average, we're only looking at tones. As the pure tone loss increased, the risk of incidence, the incidence of dementia increased, what they called log linearly. When we compared it to baseline, and when they compared it to their baseline, they noted that there was a 27% increase of hearing loss, 27% chance increase of incident all-cause dementia as compared to patients with normal hearing. But again, this is I told you some caveats about the group. Again, how are we defining dementia? We're only using hearing loss as a pure tone average. And this is just kind of showing an association. And there's a lot of questions about, does this association really exist? There's a question that there may be an overdiagnosis of dementia in individuals affected by hearing loss, or vice versa, an overdiagnosis of hearing loss in individuals affected by dementia. There's another possibility that hearing loss and cognitive decline may be shared by the same neuropathological impairment. While they might not necessarily be related, they might be, related by the same cause. Nonetheless, perception of pure tones, and I want to emphasize pure tones, not word recognition, does not require higher level orders of auditory processing. Another way we can test hearing is what we call an auditory brainstem response. It's one of the things we do to assess hearing in infants. While obviously an infant can't raise their hand to tell us when they hear a tone, we can actually ping the auditory nerve, what we think, all the way back to the auditory cortex. And patients do not need to be sedated, or they can be sedated. So a baby in the NICU, they fail their newborn hearing screen, we give them an auditory brainstem response. Well, we know there's no differences in the ABRs in those patients with Alzheimer's and with now. So again, emphasizing that pure tones might not be the best way of defining hearing loss because pure tones are not considered higher order processing. But then nonetheless, hearing loss may be causally related to dementia. And so possibly through an exhaustion of cognitive resources. I grew up in the 80s and 90s playing video games. I literally picture this as a video game power bar that's going down. And if you're focusing all your resources on hearing, you're not going to have any resources to be able to possibly remember where you put your keys or be able to walk. There's actually a study, and I'm not quoting it, people's ability to walk decreased when they had increased hearing loss, with the idea that they're sapping resources to focus on what they want to hear as opposed to what they need to do. So what's interesting is animal studies have demonstrated that environmental stimuli, enrichment, possibly analogous to humans having access to auditory and environmental stimuli, can reduce beta amyloid levels in transgenic mice models. This hypothesis is supported by studies showing that individuals who remain engaged in leisure activities have a lower risk of dementia. Again, can we keep the system robust as possibly decreasing the risk of cognitive decline? But again, I want to emphasize there are some caveats to take away from this study, again, from being a high socioeconomic group outside of Baltimore.
The BLSA study measured fitness as well, and their view. Do you know if there's any relationship between dementia and their fitness?
The study where I'm quoting the ability to walk, I don't think they're using the BLSA in that one. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't think they've looked at that from that group specifically. But again, I want to emphasize this is only 2011, and they actually published a later study in 2013 to see if they associate cognitive decline. I wouldn't be surprised that there's something out there, but not necessarily in the otolaryngology or neurotology literature. So in a separate study, though, same group, Anna Hopkins, and Frank Lin is kind of the guy behind this. The cognition came off a little uncentered. They wanted to look at whether hearing loss was independently associated with accelerated cognitive decline. So in the Health ABC study that I mentioned earlier, they looked at about 2,000 patients, again, aged between 70 and 79. And this study was started in 1997, 1998. So at baseline, patients had to have a modified mini mental state examination. So I don't know how many of you guys are referred to the MMSE. There's some problems with that too, but the idea is that was one of kind of the initial screens for dementia. I'm not to say that it's still not an initial screen for dementia, but we're kind of going away from that. We're recognizing that there's problems with that. So patients had to have a modified score above 80, which essentially translated to no cognitive impairment. So again, coming in healthy, normal. Hearing, again, was defined as a baseline pure tone average in the better hearing ear of under 25 decibels. Again, pure tone average. And then they performed cognitive tests at 5, 8, 10, and 11 years, and defining an incident cause of dementia of dropping that MMSE score below 80 or 5 points below their baseline. They also provided a cognitive test called the digital substitution, symbol substitution test, which is essentially a nonverbal test where we measure speed and executive function where participants code a series of numbers into symbols. So on the DSS test, and this is the graph in the top, this is the DSS test on the right, the MMSE on the left. I'm pointing up at the top. As the cognition, as the patient's age, so as the study progressed from left to right, they found that there were annual rates of decline were 32% greater in hearing impaired individuals. Those are the open circles below, versus the normal impaired, or I don't want to say the normal, the non-impaired hearing individuals at the top. And then they looked at this with the table, adjusting for a multivariate analysis, that individuals having hearing loss at baseline had a 24% increased risk for incident cognitive impairment incident cognitive impairment during the follow-up period compared with individuals having normal hearing, again defined as better than a pure tone average of 25 decibels. They concluded with this that hearing loss is independently associated with accelerated cognitive decline and incident cognitive impairment in community dwelling older adults. But again, I want to emphasize here, these are epidemiological retrospective studies. I mean, these are not, we're not talking high, robust clinical studies. So in a separate study, again, kind of out of the Hopkins group, again using the Health ABC study, that initial study that I just quoted only looked at 6 years. They wanted to look at it, though I say like 5, 8, 10, and 11, they just wanted to look at over the 6 years they declined. They decided to extend this out and look at those patients after 9 years, as well as trying to control for cardiovascular risk factors, diabetes, hypertension, understanding that there is a possible also causal role with those with hearing loss. So they provided a Kaplan-Meier curve, and why is this being delayed again? I'll come out and go back in. There we go. There we go. So Kaplan-Meier curves on the left. And again, Kaplan-Meier curves do not account for multivariate. I mean, you're just talking whether someone survived in this situation is on a proportion without dementia, so dementia being the survival, with the idea that these curves, and it's difficult to see the legend, moderate severe hearing loss is the lowest curve. So with the idea that the greater the risk, the greater the hearing loss at the study enrollment, the greater chance that patients, the less of a chance patients are dementia-free at the end. They then computed Cox proportional models, again accounting for multivariates, and they found that there is an association between pure tone average and incident dementia when modeled continuously. And this was adjusted for age, sex, race, education, study site, hypertension, diabetes, and history of stroke. So a lot of these initial studies have at least given us the thought process that there's something to be said about hearing loss at cognition. Again, chicken or the egg here, and that is still the question to this day. But this has prompted a number of further studies. So how do we measure cognition? There are numerous tests. This is a sampling of thousands, really. As I mentioned, the mini mental state examination, that's scored out of a score of 30. I remember in med school learning about this, but from what I understand from my colleagues at UT Southwestern, while it's not bad from, I think, a general geriatrician, general practitioner's point of view, if we're talking rehabilitative psychology, neurology, they're well beyond the MMSE. A study that came out in 1998 is the repeatable battery for the assessment of neurophysiological status. That consists of 12 subdomains, subtests, really consisting of 5 cognitive domains. So the immediate memory, visual, spatial, constructual, language, attention, and delayed memory. But as you can see here, there's a number of other tests. I mean, and this is what makes the literature a little difficult. There are studies that include the test of premorbid functioning, while the Boston naming test, other studies don't. But the point being is there are a number of different studies that are used. In the ENT world, this is becoming, this I think will become more common in the next 5 years. There was a test designed a number of years ago called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the MoCA. The problem with the MoCA is it does require instruction that needs to be verbal. So what do we do about hearing impaired individuals? So colleagues up at the University of Toronto developed the hearing impaired MoCA for patients with the idea, and this is what we are administrating at UT Southwestern, to identify essentially a cognitive baseline when patients are enrolled. So what is cognition, and what does this really translate when we hear? So listening effort, and that's kind of the idea. I actually had an ER physician that came into my office who had pretty bad hearing, and she didn't understand why she was tired at the end of the day. And this goes back to my analogy of the power bar, that you wonder if the power is sapped and they don't have any other resources for their ability to hear or do anything else. I actually tell the cochlear implant patients, if you're not tired at the end of the day, you are not struggling hard enough with that implant. An implant is not something we put on, we flip the switch, and you can hear. The brain literally retrains itself. The cochlea is tonotopically organized so that I can tell you where a specific hair cell in the cochlea is moving, what frequency that is. But then we put a cochlear implant, the brain actually reorients that tonotopical relationship so that hair cell might be activating a different portion of the frequency map than it did before. So again, the brain does require relearning, with the idea that if you're not being stimulated and you're not hearing anything, you're not going to get any benefit out of a cochlear implant. So we never promise anybody the moon with a cochlear implant, but as long as you're getting stimulation, that's advantageous. What's nice now is we tell patients to get an audiobook, download the audiobook to your implant. You can actually stream the audiobook to your cochlea, and then you can read the book at the same time. That is a little difficult. I would have problems trying to coordinate that. I can't imagine for some of my older patients being able to coordinate that. But listening effort is essentially defined, and again, there's many ways of defining it, but we understand when listeners hear speech, when we all hear speech, when you're hearing me talk, you must match the rapid incoming acoustic signal to stored representations of words and phonemes to successfully extract the intended meaning. So while I'm a native English speaker, I don't speak really much Spanish or any German. You can understand when you might hear somebody with an accent or somebody who might not be a native English speaker, you might have difficulty understanding their English and taking a little more listening effort to understand what they're saying. Listening demand reflects the various challenges associated with a given listening situation, and that includes challenges to the acoustic signal and other demands of a given situation. A great example of this is just next time you guys are in a restaurant, one, have the person you're talking to put their hand over their mouth. I guarantee you, everyone in this room who thinks they have normal hearing, you will struggle understanding what they're saying by not being able to read their lips. Secondly, you're going to have competing noise around. You're going to have that conversation on the left, on the right, and you're trying to focus on the conversation in front of you. That is competing noise. That is making it more difficult to understand. And that is one of the big limitations with a hearing aid. All a hearing aid does is increasing the sound pressure of sound going into your ears. That's still amplifying all the junk you do not want to hear. And that's another problem with the cochlear implant. A cochlear implant can, but not always help with that. And there's a lot of intricacies in the cochlear implant and programming. And while we listen generally with words between 1,000, 2,000, maybe 3,000 hertz, we use a lot of the lower frequencies for appreciation of music, for differentiating speech from noise. You lose one ear, that's also important. So, and I'm not getting into it, but there are many facets that contribute to your ability to understand. So, again, increased acoustic challenge results in greater cognitive demand, which is modulated by a listener's motivation, and I'll show you some studies, leads to increased listening effort. So, in contrast to cognitive demand, listening effort refers to the resources or energy actually used by a listener to meet cognitive demands. And one of the forefront practitioners, an audiologist, defined listening effort as the deliberate allocation of mental resources to overcome obstacles in goal pursuit when carrying out a task, with listening effort applying more specifically when tasks involve listening. This is another picture from that same kind of summary review with the figure in the upper left is a schematic of listening effort as a function of motivation and cognitive demand. I don't want to get too far ahead, but there is a study I'm going to demonstrate. Motivation does play a key role. I mean, let's be real here. As I said, I love to speak Japanese or Mandarin, but I'm not going to be able to make that out. I just don't listen. You give up. There's no motivation to do that if you're in Beijing trying to listen. And we recognize that even in English and the ability, or Spanish, with the ability that you're not able to hear as well. There's also, and this is a little controversial, and I was actually double-checking this last night, there is a question about cognitive ability. Do people with increased cognitive ability, and these are graphs shown in the lower, do they have a greater advantage of reducing their listening effort and or understanding what's being told? And again, there's controversy with that, but the question is, would there be a difference in cognitive ability to be able to understand what you're hearing? So this is an example of motivation. So, and I'll briefly get into this shortly, but there's multiple ways where we can measure listening effort, or where we think we can measure listening effort. And this is kind of the brunt of our study at UT Southwestern. In this example, they're using pupil dilation. The idea is when people struggle, the pupil dilates. And I don't have a good video, but some of these videos are kind of cool. You literally see the pupil dilate. And the idea is, this is kind of a complicated graph. The y-axis on the right of the screen is percent words correct. The x-axis at the bottom is the signal to noise ratio. So Signal, speech. If I give you something in 16 to signal to very little noise, so 16 to 1, that is clear as day. As you can see, everyone gets 100%. But as I increase that signal to noise ratio, generally we think of anywhere from 5 to 0 is competing with a restaurant. And as I told you earlier, I can get every one of you guys to qualify for a cochlear implant. If I challenge you to minus 12, I mean, no one's going to hear anything. We recognize that the ability to understand words decreases, and you can see that. Now, the y-axis on the left side of the graph is actually pupil dilation. So you can see pupil dilation is these bottom curves right here. Bottom curves right here. When the ability to understand the words in the sentence that is presented to patients' pupils not dilated, they understand words 100% of the time. But as we challenge them, as we increase that noise to the patient at the bottom, so moving right to left, the ability to understand words decreases, and as you can see, pupil dilation goes up. But don't get me wrong, I would be in that negative 12 category. I mean, you can see here, they get to negative 12, patients don't care. They're not even going to try. They don't even dilate their pupils. What's also interesting about this is actually an example of the benefit that hearing aids can do. So there are multiple, way above my head, engineering schemes to reduce the noise reduction component within natural hearing. So this is actually showing the difference with the noise reduction scheme on and the noise reduction scheme off. Off, you find people struggle early. They lose their ability to understand well quickly. You keep that noise reduction scheme on, people do understand there's actually benefit to the noise reduction scheme. So again, it's interesting how this is supposed to be, should be down there, but we'll work with it. How do we measure listening effort? So that was pupil dilation. That's a physiological measure. I'll get into a couple other physiologic measures briefly. But behavioral measures. This is pretty simple. This is a dual task paradigm. So this is actually came out of Dutch. Spion means spy. The idea is you present a sentence to a patient, you ask them to remember that last word, and then they provide them 3 separate tasks. They asked them essentially, it was on a screen, they asked them which color is red, and you had to select left or right. Then they gave you two nouns, if you will, or 2 objects, and they asked which one was an animal. And then one of the third tasks, which was random, is they gave you 2 animals, and they asked you which one was dangerous. Then they asked you, what was that word I mentioned? And so that they found, again, obviously differentiating between color, for the most part, should be pretty straightforward for us. Again, identifying the animal a little more difficult, but then identifying the dangerous animal and then asking them a word, again, you're sapping resources to remember or to remember or identify that word, you lose. We see that their ability to understand that that initial word decreases, again, as the task increases. So mean response time. This is just, they were actually measuring the time. The time to identify the animal in all these situations went up as they challenged them in the listening situation. This is an example of pupil dilation. We kind of went over that. This is a separate study. Same thing again. Sorry. There we go. This is another study looking at pupil dilation, where they are looking at sentence intelligibility. And so this is another way of challenging patients. If we decrease the ability to understand those words, so up here, dilation increases. Again, challenging them. There are many other facets we can look at from physiologic. Skin conductance. We can actually measure the sweat on an arm to determine whether or not someone's struggling. Heart rate variability is actually the one that we use, and I don't have a good picture of it, but the idea is that as you struggle, while your heart rate goes up, the variability of the heart rate actually doesn't vary that much. So when you're relaxed, the heart rate actually is all over the place, but as you become stressed, it becomes more stable, and that's another way of trying to emphasize or understand whether or not the listening effort goes up. But the $64,000 question is, this is a direct correlation. Is this actually a representation of sapping resources when we measure these things? And we don't know. It's theorized. Another thing we can do is look at neuroimaging. I won't get into the specifics too much, but the auditory cortex is over the temporal lobe. And we can actually do fMRIs, EEGs, PET scans, and there's limitations to them all. with the idea that we can actually see what gets activated when people hear. And we can, again, challenge them in certain specifics. This is actually a meta-analysis study that we're looking at a number of different noise schemes to understand where other areas of the brain might be activated. I mentioned linguistic complexity. Again, accents and whatnot. Speech noise is another thing. But this next image actually probably does it a little bit better. So they looked at fMRI, and they provided patients with basic sentences on the top, sentences better than noise, fairly straightforward. This is what we expected. But interestingly, we challenged them, made it more difficult, and sure enough, different areas of the brain lit up. So we see some of the prefrontal gyrus. So we actually are able to demonstrate that there's something going on in the brain that's changing when we struggle to what we need to hear. So while there's very little data, and this is what actually precipitated some of our studies, there's very little data to look at, does this change with hearing aids? Does this change with cochlear implants? There's a whole world of research out in cochlear implants. Can we preserve actually natural hearing? I can actually place a cochlear implant in somebody that can't hear but still uses a hearing aid, and they can still use their hearing aid and the cochlear implant after the surgery. That doesn't happen in everyone. But the idea is you're using that low-frequency natural acoustic hearing to maybe understand the difference in noise, maybe to better appreciate music, to better localize sounds, but you can't understand words, so you use the electrical component. Does this change with all that? We do not know. Briefly, and I'm running out of time, but hearing aids. So what can we do? There are some studies that have looked at, again, giving hearing aids and cochlear implants and how they change. This is a lot of information, but again, this is out of Hopkins. They provided hearing aids to patients, as well as just a healthy aging intervention scheme. I guess, I don't know. I'm a surgeon. I want to provide an action, so I don't believe in I do believe in it, but successful aging intervention is not my solution for surgery. But the idea that with a hearing intervention at the top, there was a perceived improvement of hearing handicap. That's another way of measuring somebody's ability to hear, and that's a quality of life questionnaire. And then they looked at delayed world recall. Nonetheless, even with the healthy aging intervention, they found that patients noted an improvement in the delayed word recall. But in the hearing aids, they noticed an improvement in logical memory. Again, demonstrating that there's improvement in cognition, the ability to recall words after they provide them an intervention. This is probably the most simple, straightforward study to date that I can explain. They took 6 patients. They got their baseline cognition. They got their baseline hearing test. They gave them hearing aids. After 6 months, they test their cognition. Their cognition improved. They took hearing aids away from some. They kept hearing aids on others. They took the hearing aids away. Cognition returned to baseline. Those that maintain the hearing aids maintain their cognition. Again, with the idea that hearing aids, just in and of itself, might be able to help patients either delay cognitive decline or delay, I guess, cognitive decline, I should say. I mean, the other question is, has the ship sailed by the time someone reaches 70? This goes back to that 25-year-old woman that came into my office. Should I be telling her now that she needs hearing aids? I don't know. I mean, maybe that would prevent the cognitive decline that shows up when she's 70. Maybe we catch it earlier. Who's to say? Cochlear implants. There's really, actually, I just got an email the other night. There's one out of Korea, but there's one paper out of France. This is out of 10 centers in France. There's one paper out of Italy, I think 6 centers in Italy, and then South Korea just published their data with the idea that they enrolled 100 patients, essentially 100 patients, and they looked at cognitive tests before placing an implant and then assessed patients 6 and 12 months after placing the implant. And it's a little complicated, but essentially that this is the number of abnormal tests before implantation. So you can see it's pretty evenly dispersed. But then these are the number of abnormal tests after cochlear implantation. So patients had less abnormal tests after the implant than they did before. Does this translate into anything? That's difficult to say. I mean, they didn't. If I remember correctly, they did do. That's right, the Nijmegen questionnaire. This is kind of an outdated, outmoded quality of life questionnaire. There's a colleague of mine at the University of South Carolina that's developing an improved quality of life questionnaire. But the idea is after 12 months of implantation, most of their parameters went up. But again, from a cognitive perspective, who's to say? I mean, maybe you did better on the Boston trail making test, but does that really remember where you left your keys? We don't know. This leaves us to the last slide. So this is kind of what we're doing at UT and Southwestern, looking at hearing loss on cognition. There's a couple initial aims to this study, but there's a couple follow-ups to that. Again, I could talk about hearing loss and cochlear implants, all day. But the idea is we're looking to determine if a hearing aid or a cochlear implant reduces listening effort. We're measuring listening effort with a dual task paradigm and heart rate variability, as well as quality of life questionnaires. In addition, to determine if patients with mild cognitive impairment demonstrate improvements in speech perception and quality of life. So again, maybe the ship has sailed. What about these patients that are literally out to sea? Can we slow the decline at all? We're also interested in caregiver burden. So patients who are enrolled, we're actually giving the spouse or the family member a caregiver burden questionnaire to see how they do. And then we're also going to use a neuroimaging modality. There's a lot of problems with neuroimaging. An MRI, you can't get a cochlear implant in an MRI, so to speak, because it's iron. It's magnetic. It makes noise. A CAT scan requires radiation. PET scanning requires radiation. So we're actually using functional near-infrared spectroscopy, and actually my collaborators here in the Department of Engineering, Dr. Tian, and it looks like an EEG, but the idea is it's measuring the ratio of oxygenated versus deoxygenated hemoglobin in blood in the auditory cortex. So we believe we're able to assess the superficial 1.5 centimeters of the auditory cortex. There are only a few patients that have ever had a cochlear implant measured this way. So one, we're trying to include some baseline patients, as well as there's one paper that just came out that said we can use this for cognitive demand. And then we're also going to be looking at this from the intricacies of cochlear implants. What if we do preserve those low frequencies? Do they have decreased listening effort? Again, looking at cognition. Right now, and it's actually, I bring this 25-year-old patient up. The mom actually got mad at me. She said, why is your study only limited to patients over 50? So right now, we're only enrolling patients over the age of 50. Due to some IRB issues, I can't actually state anything until another month or so. But the idea is we're hoping to enroll 200 patients over the next 2 years of really anybody. I saw a very interesting gentleman. I mean, here we're talking about hearing loss. I'm not specifying what type of hearing loss. I'm not telling you. None of those studies I just described to you has anything to do with word recognition. What is the relationship with word recognition and cognition? We don't know. But here I have a guy that lost his hearing suddenly in his right ear. So he's essentially just flying one engine with a left ear. He's doing okay. He's not super happy. He can't really wear a hearing aid because, again, everything sounds like Charlie Brown's mom in the right ear. But he's doing okay with the left ear. So what are his options? I mean, there's a number of options. He can wear a cross device, so an aid that goes from the right to the left. He can get a bone-anchored implant, which actually activates the conduction mechanism hearing in his good ear. Or maybe he gets a cochlear implant. So I said, well, hold off. I'm going to test you first. He said he's cool with whatever, actually, and it helped him get rid of his dizziness. But once we get him baseline in, he's probably going to go the Baja route only because he probably doesn't qualify for a cochlear implant just yet. And again, as I said, there's some gray areas in the cochlear implant. I'm not going to push it on him. But that's the talk. I do talk fast, and I hopefully was loud enough, and hopefully I didn't demand too much listening effort out of all you guys. But I do appreciate your time. I'll take any questions. Thank you.